Hello, I'm Barry Daniel, and this is the podcast of the Middle Way Society. Our aim is to encourage a universal approach to living a more integrated, ethical life, avoiding dogma or any appeal to authority. My guest today is Susan Greenfield. Baroness Greenfield is a neuroscientist, writer, broadcaster and member of the House of Lords. Her research has focused on brain physiology, especially on the brain mechanisms of Parkinson's and Alzheimer's diseases. She's also become well known as a populariser of science and has written numerous books including Journey to the Centres of the Mind, The Private Life of the Brain, Inside the Body and You and Me, The Neuroscience of Identity. She's recently become interested in the potential impact digital technologies can have on the mind, culminating in her latest book, Mind Change, and this will be the topic of our discussion today. Hello, Susan. Welcome to the Middle Way Society podcast.
Good. Nice to speak.
Okay. I found the book fascinating, Susan, and very accessible. I think I'm right in saying that you became interested in neuroscience after a background in the classics and
Yes.
You have, I would say, a deserved reputation for really making complex ideas palatable to a more general audience as well. Do you think your balanced education, helped in this regard, and also relatedly perhaps to you seeing things from a wider perspective?
Absolutely. I think you've taken the words right out of my mouth. I've never regretted for a single minute doing classics, and although some might say I don't have all the finer points of O-level chemistry and so on, I think that's way compensated for by having a desire to see the big picture, which is what you do in the classics, because you do history and ancient history and literature and language, and it does give you a very wide sweep of, if you like, civilization and two civilizations being compared. So I think given that was the sort of landscape I was used to, bringing that to brain sciences has proved very helpful and valuable because you don't get tied up with very small minutiae, but you do always stand back to get a wider perspective of things.
Sure, yeah. What I also took from the book is that it's very much an exploratory exercise, a process of inquiry rather than, some absolute judgment how things are going to be. To what degree do you think that has been perceived first by the scientific community and also by the general public?
Well, I don't know who the scientific community are as such. I mean, the review in Nature was a very balanced one, for example, if they're representing the scientific community. There's one or two science journalists who aren't really published neuroscientists who may have views where it's very easy to give a simplistic interpretation of something. And you're quite right. If you look at the back, there's 500, 600 peer-reviewed papers that I've tried to interpret for the general reader. And in fact, on Amazon US, someone says this is the most widely referenced book they've had on the subject. So I'm very proud that I was across the literature. I tried to be. And in that way, I had someone help me, someone called Olivia Metcalf, who just finished a PhD in video games. And I recruited her for the second draft of the book when we were writing it, because I wanted to absolutely anticipate that very criticism, which was that I'd cherry-picked or I hadn't reviewed the literature properly and so on. So as much as one can, I feel confident that whilst I haven't cited every single paper on the subject, it is a very comprehensive overview of where we are at the moment. And certainly my objective was not to bring down tablets from the mountain and give simplistic answers. As I say in the book, there's a famous quote, for every complex situation, there's always a simple answer and it's always wrong. So I think people, because they like to simplify things, because they like to have sound bites, because they like to sensationalize things, there are those who have misunderstood either on purpose or perhaps because they didn't bother reading the book, that I've come out with a clear and single view or fact. And of course, as you've rightly pointed out, that's far from the case. Okay.
Well, could you begin by telling us what prompted you to write the book and why you chose the title Mind Change?
Yeah, well, there are two separate questions. What prompted me to write it was, in fact, as much in life, a chance event that in the House of Lords there was a debate on child pornography regulation. This was back in about 2009. And this is a subject, because I'm not a lawyer, I couldn't really comment on regulation. But the etiquette in the House of Lords is if you have an area of expertise that the majority of the House doesn't have, then you'll bring that to bear in your particular speech. And I saw this as a very interesting angle, that while we were talking about technology and the impact on kids, was the fact that we know the human brain adapts to the environment, and therefore that if the environment was changing into a two-dimensional one with just hearing and vision, then the brain would adapt. Whether good or bad is up for grabs and discussion, but it would certainly adapt. So I gave this debate. I said what any neuroscientist would have said. And then I was perhaps the first person to actually say that with a platform, because the media went ballistic. And because of that, obviously, I had to give more talks, and I thought about it more, read around the subject more, and gradually, like Topsy, it grew and grew. And it became fascinating. And this led then Random House to actually approach me. I didn't approach them, to write a book on this, which I did I think I started it about 2011, 2 years after the speech. So it's been something I've been studying for about the last, 6 years,
right.
5 or 6 years. So, and I called it mind change because I wanted to echo the notion of climate change, because I saw certain parallels with these two phenomena that one of the things is that they're both unprecedented. They're both absolutely indisputably global. They're both, as you yourself pointed out, controversial. And above all, the point I really wanted to make was that they were multifaceted. With climate change, you have carbon sequestration and water shortages and all the rest of it. And here in the book, I take 20 chapters to actually explore different aspects of screen culture, whether it's social networking, video games, or search engines. I think they all present different challenges and different questions. And I think we need, in order to do them justice, those questions, we need to unpack them separately. So I thought this was, in that regard, very similar to climate change. So hence the name Mind Change, which also was supposed to intentionally be a neutral title. I'm not saying mind death or end of mind or anything like this. And I wanted deliberately to have something that was neutral, nor mind growth and best thing ever for minds. I wanted it to be completely neutral and echo climate change, and also be simple, which of course it is. It's only 2 words.
Okay, well, should we dive in then? Could you give us an overview of the book, Susan?
Up to a point, but I should say, if I could give an overview that was accurate, I wouldn't have written the book. So I can just give you
just a snapshot.
Yeah. So the book is divided then, first of all, because I'm a neuroscientist and I realise that the general reader perhaps needs to come up to speed first with what we know about the brain. The first few chapters are on the brain and how it works, and what I see as the mind. And I see the mind as the personalization of the brain, not some airy-fairy alternative to the physical brain, but to something that is reflected in the so-called plasticity of the brain, which means that the brain will adapt to the environment. The marvelous thing about being a human being is we have the evolutionary mandate to adapt to the environment. So the first few chapters are on that. And then we explore what losing the mind might be and blowing the mind, both in Alzheimer's disease and also on a more temporary basis with drugs and sex and rock and roll. And then I go on to try and give a portrait of the 21st century and how indeed it is different, not just drawing on peer-reviewed papers, but also on the goods and services that are there, as well as the general zeitgeist, for example, things like Candy and the Harlem Shake, which you can do on YouTube. I think that's important because it reflects our times and our culture, and one shouldn't ignore those things. So just an overview of that. And then we progress to looking at the 3 major areas, which is the impact of social networking on interpersonal relationships and identity, and then on video games, various aspects on risk-taking and on attention spans and on violence, and then on search engines as regards paper versus silicon and how we learn and how we think, and then with some conclusions as to a positive way forward at the end.
You expressed concerns about the notion of identity, specifically in the book. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I should say that they're concerns shared, for example, by the Chief Science Officer to the government in 2013, John Beddington, who actually published a report called Future Identities on the volatile nature of identities as a result of social networking. So it's something that is not original from me, that if you define yourself by how others see you incessantly, and if you have a constant audience for whom you are constantly providing feedback and floods of consciousness, it may be very different from previous lifestyles where identity wasn't so defined, where you saw yourself much more as a private individual with a firewall between yourself and the outside world. And I think there's growing evidence that indeed what we are seeing is a decrease in self-esteem and an increase in narcissism. There's lots of papers I cite in the book showing that now how people see themselves is much more fragile and much more vulnerable than in previous generations, where there wasn't this incessant feedback and downloading and reportage and iteration, where, if you like, identity is now constructed externally rather than inside you.
Yeah, what I found interesting was this, what you were saying about Facebook, and one of the principal drives is actually self-disclosure.
Yes, yes, exactly. It's this need so I draw a little sort of circuit where people like talking about themselves. That's one part of what being human means. And there's a lovely study showing that human subjects would rather have the opportunity to talk about themselves and take a monetary reward, which I think is very telling. So we like talking about ourselves because that actually is correlated, it's matched up with a healthier condition. What nature has invented most of the time is body language, because that will restrain and put the handbrake on to unfettered monologues about oneself. Now, of course, that body language is not there on social networking sites, which means the natural tendency to talk about yourself is not offset by the natural handbrake or body language. And therefore, a lot of very unfortunate consequences occur. For example, people will say things on Facebook that they wouldn't say to your face. I mean, very rarely would you have adults saying, "I hate you," to someone's face, because you'd be restrained by the fact of how they reacted and how they responded to you and how you then reacted. But
sure, yeah.
The sanitization of the screen, you can say all manner of things. And in fact, the temptation to say things where, if you like, the volume is turned up, is coarsened, is because you don't have all the other very subtle signs that you use when you communicate with someone, like eye contact and body language and voice tone and physical contact. They're not available. So you have to overcompensate by using these extreme sentences and words. And I think that this can only have an unhappy impact, as is being borne out in the literature, on how people see themselves and how they relate with others.
So it's a bit similar in a way that, when a lot of people get into a car, there's a change of personality because you're in this sort of bubble.
Yes, indeed. Or someone said, this is a very extreme example, in the old days of the Vietnam War, very few people would pour oil over a child and set them alight. But from the heights of dropping napalm, a lot of people did that. So when you're removed from something, it's very different from if you're seeing the direct effect of what you're doing.
Yeah. And what do you think also is happening to attention span?
Well, again, evidence is that that's decreasing. I should say there's two types of attention. Well, there's several types of attention, but the two in question here is there's selective attention, and that's just fine. You focus on something you want to focus on, and you get lots of feedback, like when you're playing a video game. But of more concern is something called sustained attention, where you yourself can generate, without some cue driving you, a long period of concentration on something. And that does seem to be suffering from, as you'd expect, because if we adapt to the environment, if the environment's fast-paced and full of distractions and you're responding very quickly to things, you won't have rehearsed the ability to sustain a long attention span in the absence of exciting and prompting cues.
Yeah. And is this tied into the Google effect about memory as well? Because
partly that. The Google effect is where you rely very heavily on external forms of reference rather than your own memory. And yes, sort of. I mean, certainly I think it applies to reading, and why reading is so important, because even for a small child, if you read them a story, that's developing an attention span, which is not there if you're just pressing buttons and reacting to something.
Yeah, okay. And what about sort of connecting with nature? For example, back to climate change. Sometimes I think, how are people going to care about things like biodiversity
Indeed.
if they don't come into contact?
Well, there's lots of terrible things that will happen if you don't come into contact. Well, if you don't get out, first of all, there'll be a greater chance of being obese. That's for sure. Yeah. We also know that exposure to natural environments enhances creativity. We also know that there's a lovely study. They took some children, this is a more recent paper, who were very poor in interpersonal skills, and half of the kids had their digital devices confiscated and went on summer camp for 5 days, and even in 5 days their interpersonal skills were significantly improved. Yeah. Now, we don't know whether that's because of the benefits of the summer camp or the absence of digital devices, probably a combination of the two. But I think very few people would say that it's a bad thing to go outside. And there's a lovely email I cite in the book from a father in Australia saying eventually he managed to get his kids out for a bike ride one weekend. And as they were cycling up and down, they started giggling and laughing spontaneously. And he said, that is music to the ears of a parent. And that noise when they're online.
Yeah, I've got a friend, Susan, who's a primary school teacher, and she was saying that there's a concern within primary now that at times teachers are having to teach kids something as basic as actual facial, recognizing facial expression.
I think my case rests. And other things as well, very, very simple skills like hopping, skipping and jumping, really simple motor skills. If they're not rehearsing, if they're stuck in front of the screen, when are they going to learn how to skip or to hop? So I think there's two big issues. One is that, of which not learning facial skills is really completely scary. I heard also in Belfast there was a teacher who had to get a therapist in because the children weren't communicating. They were, tapping away on their iPads rather than looking each other in the face. And how much more evidence do people want, or how much more do we need in order to actually say, look, come on, we need to take charge here and decide what we want and to do something about this. I mean, I don't know how much more anecdotes, evidence, papers people are expecting. I think it's a very strong case, I think.
Yeah. Okay. One of the criticisms I read about the book was this suggestion that Facebook users could develop autistic-like traits. How would you respond to that?
Well, the papers are there. I mean, what some people thought I was saying that the screen gave you autism, and of course I wasn't saying that. And I would, and I apologise to anyone who thinks that's what I said, but I've never said that. So, but I think we can talk about autistic-like behaviours. That is to say, if you're not rehearsing body language and voice tone and interpersonal communication skills face-to-face, if you're not rehearsing those things, you're not going to be good at them. And indeed, the papers are showing that, yes, people are showing traits similar to people on the spectrum. So, for example, if you record the EEG, the brain waves of people on the spectrum, then they don't have clear differences in their responses to, say, a face and a door. On the other hand, if you're a heavy internet user, you show the same profile of lack of differentiation between, say, a door and a face. So, I can't help the other. You can shoot the messenger if you like, but what I do is to try and say this is the data, this is the evidence. People can talk about it, discuss it, but there is a cluster of peer-reviewed scientific papers suggesting the not unreasonable idea that if you're not rehearsing empathy, you're not going to be very good at it. So, as far as I'm concerned, I don't see how much further one can go with that. People want to say what. Say otherwise, then all I say to people is, well, read the book and look for yourself.
Yeah, I think Ian MicGilchrist, who I think you're familiar with, he came up maybe from a slightly different angle from brain lateralization, but with very similar conclusions. Did you see a connection there too?
Yes, well, he's a very gifted neuroscientist, and I greatly admire his work on the study on the two hemispheres. I mean, the brain adapts to the environment, and it will. That's indisputable. And depending on what environment you are putting a brain in, especially a young brain, then you're going to see changes. Whether they're good or bad, we can discuss, because they're value judgments. But clearly, to ignore these things is doing a disservice to society. It's not being very helpful, and trying to just attack people on a personal level because one can't face up to the challenges it poses, I don't think it's going to be very helpful. These people who are talented or bright, their energies could be better spent in coming up with some good ideas and solutions rather than trying to be in denial.
Okay. Well, you mentioned narcissism and the rise of it earlier on. What impact do you think all these technologies can have from a wider perspective in terms of ethics?
Well, I think what we might be looking at, weirdly, not the growth of robots and people like that, but I think more the kind of profile that we might see, and this is what we need to think about, is a very infantilized one, where people are rather needy, emotionally volatile, short attention spans, just self-referential above all. You know what a 3-year-old will say, I've got a hamster, my favourite colour's red, I like this, I don't like that, I hate you. And of course that's understandable in a 3-year-old. I fear that we might be seeing people 10 years older than that with that kind of outlook and mentality, all about me. but at the same time needing reassurance, at the same time wanting to be special, at the same time wanting to be conformed, which of course is mutually compatible, at the same time very easily distracted, at the same time wanting immediate gratification, not very happy with abstract ideas, because when have they had access to abstract ideas, taking more very literally. I think this is where we need to step in and decide, is this where we want to go, or can we not design and incorporate the technology into giving people a more fulfilling, rounded life?
Well, that certainly makes sense to me. Well, you say near the end of the book that rather than asking the question, what's going to happen in the future, we should ask, how can we shape the future? With regard to the concerns you put forward in the book, what would you suggest we need to do to live with these technologies in a more balanced way?
I think what we need is to instead of the technologies being an end in themselves, we have to make them a means to an end, and that means we have to decide what is the end. Now, if I ruled the world, this is just one suggestion, I would like to see people with a very clear sense of their own identity. I'd like to see them with a sense of fulfillment, and also to be useful to society. And those three boxes are all ticked by developing creativity. And I don't mean finger painting nor writing symphonies, but just seeing the world in new ways, joining up the dots in a way they've never been joined up before. And in order to do that, you need confidence, you need to have a clear sense of who you are. But that's what we do in science all the time. We see the world in different ways. And I think that one could perhaps start to use that as a guiding principle in the education system, and indeed in general lifestyle. And within that lifestyle, things that I think are on the decline, which should be revived. One is eating together, where you talk and eat as a family or with friends. I know that's not possible 3 times a day for everyone, but to make an effort to organize it so that sometimes at least you all sit around a table and talk and eat together. Secondly, for small children, reading them stories, where you therefore develop an attention span and a sense of that lovely inner world that you conjure up, when you don't have pictures in front of you, you don't have someone's second-hand imagination, you have your own. And third, above all, getting outside and taking exercise and interacting and stimulating all 5 senses, feeling the sun on your face and smelling flowers and the grass underneath your feet and running and jumping, being in the real world. I think those 3 things, none of which are expensive, should be perhaps promoted. We shouldn't lose sight of those things, as well as obviously using the technology to develop ourselves in the best way possible. But we have to decide what we want. And for me, it would be to make these things a means to an end, with the end being individuals to respect individuality and others and have a sense of curiosity and creativity.
Yeah, and you mentioned the importance of education there. What about initiatives that in education now that, for example, like they're bringing critical thinking in at an earlier age, and philosophy, and also like mindfulness to create things like wider awareness, and your example of having a rounded education too.
Well, certainly things like mindfulness and philosophy are interesting ideas. For me, one way that would be to do the classics, which is what I did. And any kid would love to read Homer, albeit in translation, and it raises lots of ideas. And you could, in terms of the rounded education, you can do language, history, and literature all in one go. You can compare civilizations. You can ask big philosophical questions. At the same time, you can develop a strong analytical approach when you sort of deconstruct the sentences. So rather than have something disembodied called mindfulness, I myself would just get people to read stories. That's mindfulness. I mean, you're focusing on something, but then I am of my generation, as we all are, about generations, and perhaps I'm just reflecting the prejudices of my own education, but it was one that I was very grateful for.
Sure. It's funny that I do have an opposite view of mindfulness, that it's the opposite of disembodied. It's it's a very grounding thing in your experience, and anyway, what's your understanding of the middle way, Susan, and how might it relate to what we've been talking about?
Well, again,
today?
I can certainly agree. Udenagan, nothing in excess, which is what the Greeks said. That one should have a balance, and then gain from the Greek, you have 2 little words, men and debt, which is on the one hand and on the other hand, and the whole of much of Greek thought was based around the principle of on the one hand and on the other hand. So I think that's my understanding of it, which is that you should be aware of thesis and antithesis always.
Very much so, yeah. And if people wanted to find out more about your work, Susan, how would they go about it?
SusanGreenfield.com.
Great. Okay, well, it's been a real pleasure talking to you today, Susan. Thank you very much for giving up your time. You can find out more about middle way philosophy at www.middlewaysociety.org.